Hello everyone, thank you for watching this video. I want to talk to you today about testing and all aspects of it. The SAT, ACT, updates for 2020. But the first thing I want to do is introduce myself. My name is Daniel Johnson and I'm a counselor at Chaminade, and I know a lot about testing. I used to work for one of the big testing companies, then I worked for a smaller company, and for years and years I used to do my own private SAT test prep. And so I've seen a lot of how different people do things, and I know a lot about the industry, and I want to share a lot of that with you today. Let's talk about the overview of what's going to be in this video. The first thing that a lot of people want to talk about are the coronavirus changes, because there's been a lot of changes to what testing means to each of us this year. So I want to talk a lot about that. I want to talk about the importance, because for some people testing will be really important this year, and for others it won't matter as much. Then there's a lot of common questions about the ACT versus the SAT and which one they should choose. I also want to talk about different types of tests, like the subject tests and AP exams. Finally, you should be prepping for these tests, so let's talk about test prep and which mode fits you the best. And then finally, you need to send your scores, so I want to talk about how you do that, and testing accommodations. So let's start off with talking about coronavirus changes for the fall of 2020. The big question that a lot of seniors are asking is, can I even test? No. Right now you can't test. The feedback that I'm getting from the College Board and the ACT and all of you students and parents is that there aren't tests out there right now. Maybe if you travel to a different state, which is inadvisable. But right now, we can't have school, and if we can't have school, we can't have a bunch of kids in a classroom for hours on end taking a test. So tests are going to be canceled until that dynamic changes. And when that's going to change is really up in the air and outside of our control. So we really have to be flexible and talk about the different options that we have in front of us. So let's talk about fall testing in general. There are several tests that you can take in the fall. The last one that you can traditionally take to go towards schools like the UCs, Cal States, the majority of private schools, and regular decision deadlines is the December 5th test date. That's a long time from now, and I really hope that we have things under control by then. So if you find that you really need a test date, you might want to aim for the December 5th exam date. Other parents and people have given me feedback about trying to sign up for testing in different counties, Orange County, Ventura County, rather than Los Angeles County, because Los Angeles County might have different restrictions than different counties. And in other places in the country where the state government hasn't mandated anything, that has made a difference, where one county the test was not allowed to be taken and another county it was. Just something to keep in the back of your head. And then finally, one thing that might be on the table is spring testing. There are tests in March and May. Traditionally, those have been way too late, and juniors have taken those instead. This is a different year, and so if you really need a test for scholarships or maybe for recruitment in some way, shape, or form, you just really need a test, then maybe the March one might work. But traditionally, that's too late. So we're going to be banking on the December date. If we even need one at all, we're going to talk about test optional and all the schools that don't need testing at all. Finally, there's something in the works, the Chaminade SAT administration. This is something that we're looking into. It's not a for sure thing, and a lot of the same rules that apply for a general testing date will apply to a Chaminade specific test. But if we can, we want to make sure that we offer the SAT on Chaminade's campus for Chaminade students, and we administer it. So this is something we're working towards, but as you can imagine, with all the hoops of starting school and all of the different restrictions, and above all else, the safety involved, we're not going to rush into this. So we're going to look at it really seriously, but we're only going to do it if everyone approves and we can conduct it safely. So keep an eye out for updates around this. For right now, it's still in the investigative stage. So what we want to do is plan for every contingency. So we're not dependent on Chaminade offering the test. We're not dependent on taking it in, September or November. We want to make sure that we have all contingencies covered. And that's where we get to the next topic, which is, do I even need these tests? There are tons of schools now that are test optional. And I would say, what was the statistic? It was way more than half of the schools in the United States are going test optional. And more schools are going test optional every single day. So if you don't have the test, chances are you can still apply to all of your universities that you want to apply to without the SAT or the ACT. One thing to consider, though, is that test optional is not the same as no tests considered. There are some schools out there that say, no, it's not fair to consider tests from some students and not others. We're just going to consider no exams. But those schools are much fewer. Most of them are just saying that they're going to be test optional. And we don't have all of the insights into the admissions offices to know how they're going to evaluate test optional versus no test considers. I'm going to give you some insights onto how schools evaluate students without testing a little bit later. One thing that's the most important is that you get your college list together, because you need to look at your colleges and find out if test optional is even an option for you. You need to find out whether they're even pushing for you to take the exam. You could be applying to a lot of schools that just say, nope, don't worry about it, don't take the test. Okay? And then your list sort of solves this problem for itself. The UCs and the CSUs, they are all going test optional, and they're going into that really heavily. So that's something that you can keep in the back of your head. Like I mentioned before, most schools are going test optional. NCAA used to have a mandate that said in order to be NCAA approved and to play college sports, you needed to have a test. They waived that last year, and just a couple days ago, they've waived it this year as well. You can see right here they have an eligibility center announcement. This document will be a link in the description down below explaining that the rules have changed and you don't need testing anymore to be NCAA approved. So that solves that issue. Another thing is that every single school is going to have their own coronavirus updates. The University of California is constantly pushing out coronavirus updates, and many campuses are doing more than just saying they're going test optional. They're telling you how they're using your test. And so checking with each individual website is going to be really good. Again, harps on how important your college list is. And then finally, this is NACAC, National Association of College Admission Counseling, and it's has a list of all of the test optional schools. Notice they say more than 1,400 schools are going test optional. There's also Fair Test that has a list of all the test optional schools. And so you can stay up to date on which schools are test optional. Now, speaking of test optional, let's talk about it a little bit. Even before the coronavirus pandemic, thousands of schools across the United States did not require the SAT or ACT. In general, educators, admissions officers, we don't really like the SAT or the ACT. I don't think it's a good measurement of how you're going to do in college. And honestly, your GPA, your involvement has a lot more of indicator how you're going to do in college than how you perform on one test on one day. And so colleges agree. They say, look, it messes with diversity, it limits accessibility. We don't want to breed into kids an over-reliance on tests, especially because there's very few tests when you enter the real world. They want to attract students that do well in classes, not necessarily do well on the single day. And really, there are other ways of measuring high performance than the exam. And in fact, many competitive schools will look at students without their tests. Now, what they might do is look at students in a little bit different light. They might highlight those GPA requirements. The UCs hinted at the idea of them sort of weighting their GPA requirements heavier with the absence of testing. Many other schools might require things like graded assignments. Very few will have interviews, but some of them might. And many of them still want test scores if they're strong. And we'll talk about that. Whether it's a good choice for you to submit your scores or not if you have them. Because you might have your scores, whether you took it a long time ago or you take it in December or whatever, and you might have the decision point of, well, do I want to submit these? I mentioned fairtest.org. You can go to fairtest.org and look up all of the schools and their most common information about the coronavirus and how test optional they are. So let's get into the big subject of, should I submit my test scores? Well, the most important thing is you get the most updated information about your college and you. You should kind of know what your test scores would be. If you just are taking your PSATs from your junior year, that might not be the most updated information. So you might want to take a SAT or ACT diagnostic so that you know about how you score, so you can decide whether working towards getting a test is something really good for you, if it distinguishes you from other people. Also, you're going to want to look at all of your schools on your list and find out if they're even taking the test. Your dream school might say, no, we're not considering tests. In which case, you don't need to bend over backwards to submit test scores to your safety school. Okay, so you also have to think, are you even improving your chances by including SATs or ACTs? And then make sure your list has safety schools. Just in general, make sure they have safety schools. It's so important. But also make sure that they have safety schools that account for this testing uncertainty. You could have a great school list and a plan to take the test in December, but if your test doesn't go through in December, I don't want your list to fall apart. So make sure that you have every contingency built into your college list. Now, how do you know if you are improving your chances by including a test score? Well, that's where the Chaminade scattergram can kind of give you a better idea. It doesn't really matter what school this is right here, but you can see that there's sort of this trajectory. There's this little line going up that way. And you can see that the majority of students fall within this certain range of GPA versus SAT score. And so if you fall, if like your GPA is about the same on average on this line as your test scores, then you're not really giving them very much information. You're not giving them anything extra. But if you're one of these outliers, if your test scores go far beyond what other people are getting in terms of their GPA, then your test scores could be a big indicator for that school that you want to attend there. Similarly, if you actually have a higher GPA and a lower test score than this sort of trajectory, this line that you see students getting into, then that might be an indication that you do not want to submit your test scores. Usually you can kind of tell, if you have your GPA and your test scores, and this line kind of falls into that. If you have like 1,000, it looks like you have close to a 3.0. If you have about a 3.5, you should be getting about a 1,200. If you have a 4.0, they're kind of expecting to see close to a 1,400. So you can kind of take those benchmarks in general and get an idea of whether your test scores match your GPA or whether they exceed your GPA. If they exceed your GPA, you want to do everything possible to get them your test scores. If they match your GPA, you're not really showing them anything extra, right? And if your GPA exceeds your test scores, then this whole system of going test optional could benefit you a lot more than the average student. Okay, that was a little bit tricky, but hopefully you followed along and you can kind of visualize what your test is and how it correlates to your GPA. And you could look up the scattergram for every single school you're applying to in Naviance. Now, let's talk a little bit about why scores matter in general for schools. Colleges use them really heavy in their admissions decisions, mostly because it's pretty easy. You get assigned a number compared to all sorts of other students, and they're normalized and averaged across bell curves, and so schools can kind of pretty easily predict, how you're doing academically. It's not a good predictor, but it's pretty easy to use. Most colleges also publish this information, and so if you get a super high score, colleges will love to publish. We had 22 students have a perfect SAT score in this incoming freshman class. And also test scores and publishing that has to do with their prestige and their ranking and their future admissions. If they're seen as a school that takes really smart kids, more kids want to go to their school. Scores also let colleges find students. You probably clicked a little button on your PSAT and then you got so many emails you regretted selecting that box. But colleges can search out students with high scores. Colleges also may use the scores for scholarships. And this is actually one thing you want to keep in the back of your head. Even though some schools might have said, don't worry, we don't need test scores, there are some scholarships that say, oh no, we're required to have test scores. In fact, this legal requirement of test scores might be one of the reasons why some schools haven't budged on that yet. There are some scholarships where they're legal written documents that define how the scholarship is measured. And if in that legal written document it says that you need test scores, it's very hard for them to change the structure of the scholarship immediately, even if the financial aid department wants to. Same thing with an admissions department. An admissions department might be like, oh my gosh, let's get rid of the SAT or ACT. But the Board of Regents or even the state government might have laws in place that say you need to take test scores and you need to have these certain rigorous standards in your public school. So sometimes we might just be waiting for the gears of government or bureaucracy to turn a little bit more for schools to finally say, don't worry, we're test optional, or don't worry, you don't need it for this scholarship. That's why it's really important to have your list to stay up to date with all of your schools, especially this year. All right. Colleges also consider scores in different ways. Some of them weight them evenly with GPA. A lot of them weight them really heavily. Some of them take all of your test scores. Some of them only want the highest score. Some of them will even super score. I'll talk about that in a second. But really, they're used pretty heavily in general, even if they might not be used as much this year. So, the most important thing that matters is your GPA. GPA is by far the most important. Remember, schools will recalculate your GPA in some way, shape, or form. The most common thing they'll do is pull out your PE class in religion. Most common thing they'll do is pull out the weights or normalize your weights against other students in schools so that everyone's kind of on the same playing field when they evaluate it. Your schedule, very important. If you took 4 years of pottery, you probably are really good at pottery, but you didn't challenge yourself academically for their academic school. Progression. Colleges really care that you challenge yourself and you just keep increasing in rigor. And so your GPA is kind of influenced by these other qualities so that they can get a better idea of your whole academic record rather than just the number, 3.8, 4.2. Now, let's talk about the SAT and the ACT. The ACT has an English section, a math section, a reading section, and a science section. It also has an optional writing section. It's not optional. You have to sign up for it. There are many schools out there that if you don't sign up for the optional writing section, they won't even consider your score from the English, math, reading, and science. Basically, the format of the ACT was redesigned and the format of the SAT was redesigned, and now they're really similar. So there used to be all of these big differences. Now they're not. One of the big differences is the science section. Okay? This science section doesn't really exist on the SAT, and so if you like the science section on the ACT, that might mean it's a good fit for you. Let's talk about the SAT, and then we'll be able to compare the two. This is the ACT website. You can sign up for it, do all sorts of stuff like that. Let's talk about the SAT. There's a reading section, a writing section, a math section without a calculator and with a calculator, an optional writing section, not optional, a not optional writing section. And honestly, there's so much overlap. These tests are approximately the same length. They are also normalized and standardized, which means that the number that you get right doesn't really determine your score. It's kind of how you place among other people. Basically, both of these tests are trying to get a really nice bell curve and basically trying to take the average student and putting them in the middle 50th percentile. That's why you might hear your students complaining that, oh, on this test date of the SAT, I missed one question and got a perfect score, but on this test question, on this test day, I missed one question and I got, a horrible test score. Whatever. So, which one is right for you? Well, scoring can be a little bit different, but for the most part, there's a lot of similarities between them. There's no wrong answer penalty. The scoring might be different, but again, we have this concordance table, so you can still figure out exactly how you scored across others. I mentioned a lot of times they're scored and measured through percentiles, so that's not even something that you need to consider. Before I talk about SuperScore, I want to talk about which one. So let's go back. So which one should you choose? Well, honestly, you're going to hate this advice, but you should try them out. You should do a diagnostic of each of them, find out which one you like the more. Very few students actually score substantially better on one than the other. A lot of times the reason why they score higher is outside influences, like what time you woke up and when you went to bed and how hungry you were, how bored you were, stuff like that. One other good indicator of which test you should take is the math section. Usually students have the strongest emotions dealing with the math section. Students have given feedback like, the ACT math is more straightforward but harder. The SAT math is really tricky, but when it comes to the actual math, it's super duper easy. Okay? But these are all feelings. I would trust your gut feeling if you're choosing a test, because then you'd probably pick the test that you like the most and the one that you're going to study for the most, because studying is something that you definitely need to do. Now, this is mostly directed towards seniors, and you might not be doing a lot of studying right now. You probably have already chosen your test of choice. In fact, many of you that I talk to have already studied over the summer, not gotten a chance to take the test, and then now you're like losing all of your wonderful ground you had made up while studying for this test. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Okay. If you need extra help about which test to choose, don't be afraid to talk to your counselor. Let's talk about a SuperScore really fast. SuperScore is a combination of the highest scores in each section from different sittings. Odds of you having a lot of different sittings of this test are relatively low. But we're going to talk about SuperScore anyways. So let's say that John took the test twice, in May and October. In May, he got a math score of 550, and in October, he got one with 650. Okay. In reading, in May, they got a 650, and in October, they messed up math, and they got a 550. So even though both of these test scores ended up with a 1200 in both individual sittings, most schools would say, sorry, you got a 1200 on this. Some schools will SuperScore and take the high score in math from October, the high score in reading from May, and combine those together, and John just made up an easy 100 points on the SAT. Amazing. It's recommended that students send all test scores so that colleges see the highest score on each section. Colleges say constantly that they are not looking to find things to exclude them from coming to their school. Students are always freaking out. They're like, oh my gosh, I don't want the college to see how I screwed up in May. Please don't send it, don't send it, don't send it. Look, there's this thing called score choice on the college board, and if you want to go through score choice and leave that bad testing date out, it's fine, it's your choice. But colleges have said over and over again that they're not going to punish you for a bad day. They're there to find all the information they can to make sure that you can get into their school. So if there's even a tiny bit of good information from a test date, we definitely suggest that you send it in. I already talked a little bit about which test you should take. And we're just going to move on to a different type of test. Subject tests. Subject tests are multiple choice exams on a given subject area. You can take up to 3 on a given test date, 1 hour per exam. They're not required by most colleges, and it's really recommended for students in applicable AP classes or have a strong propensity in that area. So let's say that you took an AP class and you want to be able to show off how great you are in AP biology. And so you could take a subject test in biology and get this great score to brag and show off about how you're doing. Odds are you've already studied for this exam, and so maybe you have the chance to take it. again, this timing might be more right for juniors or sophomores rather than you seniors, but some of you might still need to know about subject tests. Another thing that could be important is that you are really good at a subject, but you really didn't distinguish yourself in that area. Let's say that you really wanted to take AP US History. You love it. You are great at studying for it and everything like that. It's a passion of yours, but it didn't fit into your schedule. Take the subject test. Prove to them that you know this subject really well. One thing that's important is that your AP tests are just supposed to help you. Like, they're not considered for college acceptances. They're for college credit. Okay, so if you take an AP class, your grade in the AP class is this great, all right, good job, for getting into college, but your AP test is not considered. So if you need a test to be considered, it's the subject test that's going to take that place. Students can demonstrate mastery with this stuff. Sometimes students will take subject tests when they're really great at an outside subject. For example, many homeschool students will take tons of subject tests because they want to prove that they really know this subject and it wasn't just teacher dad that gave them the A. Also, certain majors will require subject tests like Math 2 and Physics for engineering students. These requirements might still be in place. So you definitely want to consider looking at your major and looking at what testing requirements they have for your major. When I was looking through some of these lists of test optional schools, there's schools that are test optional, but then there's this like little note that says only like specific majors are not test optional. So make sure that you find out everything about the school, but also about your specific major. Other information about subject tests, remember this information can change. A lot of schools want it, especially top schools. Schools will strongly recommend it, and actually many schools are looking for subject tests from a strong school like Chaminade. They're saying, look, you're going to one of the best schools out there. We want to see how far you can push yourself. And part of that is taking these exams. That's in other years. This year's completely different, okay? So you hear all this stuff and you've heard this from us last year. This year's different. So don't feel like you need to squeeze in a subject test. They're not going to be looking for you to have subject tests this year. Again, check your school websites. AP exams. Colleges expect you to take the test if you take the class. But remember, the grade in the class is the important part, not the score on the test. There are huge advantages to passing the test. Different schools will have different rules on how they take them. But most schools will take a 3, a 4, or 5 and give you college credit. And different schools will have different ways that they'll accept college credit. But this can give you a huge boost in college. Just imagine you are going to have a hard year. It's your sophomore year of college and you're taking organic chemistry. Okay. Everyone says it's horrible. You have these extra labs that you have to do. You're thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be miserable. But wait a second. You passed a bunch of AP exams. You have room in your schedule. Heck, if you're taking a bad semester, take 12 or 14 units instead of 16 or 18. Now you have several extra hours a day and that much less work to do, so you can focus on the crazy thing like organic chemistry. Do other stuff like I studied abroad in London, and when I studied abroad, I did not take the maximum credits. I took the least number of credits possible so I could do things like travel and, leave on a Friday and go away for the weekend. It also lets you take classes that you wouldn't normally. If you want to take a weird class like surfing or hiking, you can do that and not worry about it messing up your schedule. I took a guitar class for no reason other than I wanted to learn to play guitar. And it's college, it's a free class. I could just learn guitar. And I could do that because I had room in my schedule. Another thing that you could consider doing is just filling up all those classes and double majoring. If you don't have a lot of classes that you need to take because you've fulfilled these prerequisites with AP exams, then you can fill up those class periods with other classes and then suddenly double major. So there's a lot of advantages to taking the AP exams really seriously and getting high scores and transferring those credits into your school. All right. the AP exams are positive. It's not a punishment. If you crash and burn and get a 0, don't freak out. Your teacher might be mad at you, but everything will be just fine. So the most important thing you have for testing is to have a plan. You need to have a plan. Are you self-studying? Are you taking classes? Are you getting tutoring? How are you preparing? Because here's the thing. Remember how I said these tests are normalized, which means that they take the bell curve and they adjust it and everything. You are directly competing against your peers. You are. You're directly competing against a bunch of college-bound students. And guess what? They're studying for the SAT. And the thing that's also really important is that studying works. It makes you better. Like, there's a reason why test prep companies and your counselors and everyone are saying study, because you get a higher score when you do it. So, test preparation in general prepares you by having you avoid stress, okay? Gives you feedback on where you need improvement. And really what it does a lot of times is familiarizes yourself with what's going on this test. Suddenly, none of these questions are foreign to you. These questions aren't something that you've never seen before. Even though all the numbers might be different, you're like, I recognize that question. That happens all the time. You read one of the English questions and it has you sort of coming up with a word in context, and you're like, I've done this exercise 10, 20 times before. I can solve this type of question. So getting familiar with the types of questions and the pacing and training your brain to be able to focus for that amount of time is really, really valuable. Now, long-term study plans are good. We really suggest that you start studying a pretty long time ahead of schedule, like 8 to 10 weeks beforehand. Sometimes, though, there are some people out there that say you should be studying for the SAT during 8th grade. Again, if you're a senior, you're probably not concerned with this right now. But if you're someone else watching this, we want to talk a little bit about the effectiveness of super long-term study plans. Basically, they have serious diminishing returns. If you are studying for months and months and months, for years for the SAT, you might see improvement and get better. But just going to school and reading and taking math classes and growing up will have you getting better too. Look, if you exercise your brain, it's going to get stronger. So whether you're exercising it doing reading, which by the way is linked to high scores, higher than almost everything else out there, but okay. Whether it's reading or being in school or studying for the SAT, you exercise your brain, it's going to get stronger, you're going to do better at this. Okay, but if you're looking for really big returns on the SAT, the very first time you do some studying, you might see a 100-point increase and you're like, yes! Okay, but the next time, to get that extra 100 points, you're not just studying for a month, you're studying for 2 months to get that extra 100 points. And then to get that extra 50 points, you're studying for 3 months. You might notice this in other things like sports, or losing weight or something like that, where you work a little bit and suddenly you can run way faster. But then you start plateauing, you know what I mean? Like then you start having these diminishing returns, and now it takes a ton of work to get a fraction of a second faster. Okay. So I now want to talk a little bit about test prep and some of the promises. Remember, I used to work for big test prep companies, and so I know exactly how they operate. And one of the most important things for you to know is that for the most part, they work. Okay? These are not empty promises because they're actually advertising test prep and telling your student to study this good stuff. And if they do, they're going to do well. But you have to know what you're paying for. So a lot of test prep companies will advertise diagnostics. They're like, oh, you'll get 5, free diagnostics. You'll take 5 full-length tests throughout this session. It's amazing. Well, what are you actually paying for? Because I can give you 5 free tests, and you can sit down with your cell phone and time yourself and grade yourself. Like, are you paying for like a babysitter or like someone to give you feedback on your test? I'm as your counselor, I'll give you feedback on your test if you bring it into me. So diagnostics shouldn't be as big of a selling point as it is. Again, we have free diagnostics. I'll have a link in the description that'll take you over to their websites. You can download dozens of free tests. So what are you paying for? Structure. This is a big, big thing. And I think that it's really, really valuable, actually. When I was in high school, I had an SAT tutor, and my mom thought I needed it, and I did need it, just because I couldn't focus. I wasn't going to just sit down and study for the SAT. I tried. I really did. But I was focused on my teachers that were going to yell at me the next day for not having my assignment in. And SAT was always like, I'll do it next time. I'll do it next time. And you just keep pushing it off. And SAT prep is really good when it's consistent. You do a little bit every time, you do a little bit every day, and you keep it at the forefront of your brain. And so sometimes these test prep companies, these tutors, they give you a lot of structure. And that's really, really good. And for some students, that's a necessity. For others, you're like, I'm paying how much for you to just give my kid a calendar of homework? It doesn't make sense to you. Okay. And again, each of your families are going to have different takes on, how much is too much money, and what, different students are going to have different takes on it, and how responsible they are, and all that good stuff. Okay. The other thing is, are you going to be part of a class, or are you going to be part of a system that's only sort of introducing you to test-taking strategies, or are they actually going to give you assistance in the area of subjects? For example, are they just going to teach you the techniques of taking a test, or if it comes down to it, are they going to reteach you triangles? You're like, oh, geometry. Oh, I forgot about that. So triangles. Okay, let's figure that out. And so sometimes there are tutors that are able to adapt and classes that are able to adapt and really teach you that subject area content. But there's others that don't. They have a set schedule. They're there to teach you very specific things and move on. And if you need to learn about triangles again, or, what do I do when I multiply, exponents? I don't know anymore. You're going to need to get some extra help in those areas, or maybe get help on your own. Okay. So remember, a lot of this test prep has to do with prepping for the test, not prepping for that background subject area. By the way, we recommend, 6, 8, 10 weeks to get ready for the test. If you forgot all the math that you've ever been taught, you might need longer than that. So all of these test prep suggestions are just to get ready and familiar for the test. It's not to relearn all of these things that you might have forgotten in the past. All right, another thing the test prep companies do all the time is they guarantee improvement. I used to guarantee improvement. It's very easy to guarantee improvement, because if you follow instructions and study every day, you're going to improve. So it's not really a big guarantee where you're like, wow, this is amazing. Another thing sometimes that they'll do, and this is a little bit shady, but there's shady people out there, is that they'll give you one of the harder SATs as a diagnostic at first, so that you're a little bit scared that your test score is a little bit lower than average, and they'll maybe use that as a benchmark for their guaranteed improvement. Okay, so again, most of the time they can confidently guarantee improvement, because if your student works, they will improve. So they don't need those shady things, but those things are still out there. Okay, another thing that we're really worried about from the counseling side of things is upselling counseling services. Again, test prep, we feel like that could be fine, but sometimes they want to actually sell you more stuff. They'll give you some test prep, and then they're like, okay, well now buy more things. So Chaminade is a full service counseling department. We do everything. And each of us in the office also have different things that we're really, really good at. I mentioned that I'm really knowledgeable about testing. Myself and Ms. Juarez. Ms. Juarez also used to be the chair of the English department, taught AP English. I used to teach AP English, language and literature. We're both excellent at essay writing. So sometimes when it comes down to an essay writing thing, we'll sort of spearhead that and take over that area and give people special feedback. But when it comes to sports, Mr. Borchert, he's got all the information when it comes to the NCAA and sports. And so sometimes when there's something tricky there, we'll be able to collaborate and bring him on it. Okay. So that's what makes us a really, really good team. And we can't promise that outside counselors have that kind of team dynamic. Okay. Sometimes a lot of times they give conflicting advice than us. And if you have an outside counselor, that's great. Bounce the advice off of us too, and we'll give you our honest opinion. We want you to take a lot of different opinions and figure out what's right for you. Another thing is that colleges want to hear from us. They want to hear from the student's real counselor. We write their secondary school report. We write their letter of recommendation going out to their schools. We're the ones directly in contact with all of the colleges. And so if a lot of the student's information is going to an outside counselor, that can be really frustrating because schools want us to be that point of contact. We want to know everything to be a good point of contact, and we hate to have something interrupt that flow of information. Now, an outside counselor could be good for you. Again, sometimes students have a really hard time focusing. And you don't want college to be a daily battle. So you're like, I'm going to hire a person. This is not going to be a daily battle. They're going to organize their application and they're going to get this done. You know what? That's fine. Just make sure that Chaminade counselors are part of the loop. Okay. You also have to know that you don't need it. You can always come to your counselor and get help. We have resources for helping your student get through this, especially during this time. We're putting out these extra videos. We're available in team meetings. We're trying to be as available as possible so that students can get any question answered that they want. Okay? And if you're still hesitant about what the right choice is for you and your student, talk to your counselor. We're gonna be honest with you. It's another thing too. We're not trying to upsell you anything. We're just trying to be honest, and we all have the same goals at heart. Care about your kids, care about you. We want you to go to college. All right. I'm going to say this 5 times. You have to send your test scores. 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 I can't send your test scores, okay? They have to be sent by you. They're not on your transcript, and they need to come directly from the SAT or ACT. Send it 2 weeks before they're due, because they have this thing called expedited sending or whatever. They send it expedited, but it's sent through the internet, so I don't know how they make the internet faster, but they charge you extra money. Look, just send them early. There's no reason not to. You send in your scores, okay? Some schools have you self-report your scores, which means that you write your scores down and they trust you. And then when they let you in, they'll confirm your scores later. Okay? Every single one of these sites has send your scores on it. So, for example, by the way, look at this free SAT prep right there on the front page. Amazing. But basically, you can click on your scores and you can log in, and then you can send your scores from there. Same thing here. There's a button right over here that just says send your scores. So you click on it, you log in, you type in the name of your schools, and you send your scores. Finally, one thing I want to talk about is testing accommodations. So testing accommodations, it's not a process to find an advantage in testing. It's actually designed to even the playing field. Okay? If your student has a hard time with processing or reads slowly, if there's something going on with their learning, then they might need a testing accommodation. These are not easy to get. They're pretty difficult, and it's a process. Okay? And the most common thing that you get is 50% extra time. Okay? Other accommodations may include multi-day testing, large print exams, and a reader, extra breaks, things like that. Okay? Basically, if you're not already using these on final exams at Chaminade, then you're probably not getting them for the SAT or the ACT. So this needs to be something that you're already doing and that you're in contact with the school about. And this is a personal process. This is, again, not a place where you can say, well, will this benefit me, or should I? No. Okay, it's really individual to you, and you have to think about it. I had a student years ago who definitely deserved accommodations. And he had ADHD, and he wasn't going to take the accommodations. And I was like, well, why not? And he's like, well, Mr. Johnson, I would rather be rushed on the last 5 questions of every single section than to have the test last an extra 2 hours. He's like, I would be so burnt out in a 5-hour, 6-hour exam. He's like, I just wouldn't be able to focus on the last part of the test. Look, that's fine if I'm rushed on the hardest questions. He's like, I'm not getting those right anyway. So I guess on the last 2 or 3 anyway. So what? I'm a little bit rushed. He's like, but just being able to focus and not having to take a 5-hour test is totally worth it. So again, it's up to your student and how they fit in the most. The ACT and SAT have different accommodation processes. The most important person to talk to is Catherine Howard. She's our school therapist. She's the one that'll collect documentation, give you information about how to do this. She's the one that'll submit the paperwork and apply for accommodations, all that good stuff. Okay, so this is a very general thing about testing accommodations. You can talk to her for more specific information. And that's it. I've talked for quite a long time about testing. There's a lot to talk about, and there's still more to talk about, and I'm sure you have any questions. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to email your counselor. We're going to answer some comments in this comment section down below, but it might not be as frequent as you like, but definitely put some questions in there. And also there's going to be resources in the link in the description. There'll be tons of things to click on. Also, the Chaminade Counseling Blackboard page has a lot of different resources. And remember, this is one of a series of videos. Counselors are doing videos about all sorts of subjects in the college application process. So if there's some other component that you need to understand, go find that video, look that up, and learn more about the process. And then remember, we're all here to help you, and you are going to get into college. All right, everyone. Bye-bye.